Appreciate everyone that's taken the time today to join us for the webinar. As Sarah mentioned, my background, I've primarily spent most of my time with the Dräger detector tube systems, the Dräger CMS, which was launched about 24 years ago, and the recent launch of the Exact 7000 will also be part of my portfolio responsibilities here at Draeger. So appreciate the opportunity today to spend a little bit of time. We've had some chats over the last few weeks with regards to doing some sort of a webinar on Dräger tubes, but not from the standpoint so much of how to use them and different applications, and not so much as, what are some of the advantages to the Dräger tube system, to some of the competitive lines of detector tubes that are available today. So that's really going to be the thrust of today's presentation. And as Sarah mentioned, we will save probably 10 or 15 minutes that we'll have time to address some questions and maybe cover anything that maybe I haven't covered adequately during the presentation. So with that, we will go ahead and get started, and we'll jump right into basically when we talk about detector tubes. I always like to mention that we're talking about a detector tube system. So whether you're using Dräger detector tubes or any other manufacturer, you want to consider that the pump that has been designed by that manufacturer for use with those particular detector tubes is really as an important element as the detector tubes are, from the standpoint that the flow characteristics through that detector tube are governed not only by the packing in the tube, but also by the physics of the pump itself, as to the resistance of if they have springs, the resistance of the vacuum system, and so forth. And while all of these pumps on a full stroke are pulling 100 cc's, it is really that combination, that system, that are going to produce the most accurate, most precise measurement results. Now, one thing about Draeger that is a little unique is that we also have an intrinsically safe electronic version of a pump that can be used with our detector tubes. So basically all the manufacturers have, to some degree, the capabilities of detecting gases, vapors, aerosols, some in air, some in water, even some for soil detection and so forth. We talk about Draeger having more than 220 different types of detector tubes, and we sometimes get comments back, well, I know so-and-so has 215 different detector tubes. We thought Draeger had the biggest program. That's true. There are, in some cases, manufacturers that have more tubes than us. But one thing that Draeger have done over the last few years, and I think we've done a pretty good job of that, is to actually condense and to some degree reinvent our detector tube portfolio. And a classic example that's happening right now is with methyl bromide tubes. Draeger currently have 4 methyl bromide tubes available, and we've introduced one in the last year or so that, as we work down our inventory, is going to replace basically all the other ones because of the way it's been designed, because it's got a very dynamic calibration range or measurement range. It's got 2 scales on the tube, which make it infinitely easier for an end customer to use that tube over some of the other tubes, not only competitors' tubes, but some of the existing Draeger tubes. So when we talk about the number of tubes in a program, that doesn't always tell the full story. We also talk about measurements. In this particular slide, we're saying our measurements completed in about 30 seconds to 4 minutes. So what relevance does that have in regard to detector tube measurements? Some of our competitors often tout and promote majority of their detector tubes require 1 pump stroke. Well, that 1 pump stroke is often the case for the scaled marks on the individual tubes, but they also often offer other range capabilities by varying that number of strokes. And of course, if it's 1 stroke, in most cases, we're taking additional strokes, maybe 2 strokes or 3 strokes or 5 strokes. When you consider that the average opening time with a piston style type of sampling pump is 1 to 2 minutes, and simply check the operating instructions for those tubes and you'll see that to be true. At the moment you start increasing the number of pump strokes, suddenly the amount of time for carrying out a measurement becomes considerably longer and considerably more involved from the standpoint of additional pump strokes therefore imply, or should at least, that there has to be some manipulation of the scale that's read from the tube. So now we need to apply some multiplier or some divider to determine the actual concentration. And that's on the scale printed on the tube. So one of the things, like I say, the Draeger have done is by putting 2 scales on the tube and saying 1 stroke or 2 strokes, whatever it may be, for the high range, and then based on a color change or not, take the additional number of pump strokes for a total of maybe 5 or 10, let's say, and then turn the tube about 90 degrees and read it on a separate scale, is infinitely easier for a customer to use that particular tube. Also, by the way, those calibration marks, we've actually generated each mark using 3 independent tube readers to ensure that each mark is as precise as possible. If you compare that to taking a given scale and applying a multiplier to it, I'll assure you, you don't always have the same level of accuracy and precision because they're not always as linear as one might think in looking at a detector tube. So I'd like to point out a couple of those things, and we'll delve into those in a little bit more as we go along. And the last bullet point here, again, regarding the 2 scales on the tubes, I find that customers that realize that we have those 2 scales on the tubes are very happy to have that, rather than trying to interpret measurement results using a variable number of strokes and then trying to interpret what that conversion means using a multiplying factor or dividing factor. This is one example of a detector tube that Draeger have. This particular one is a phosphine tube. It's a relatively new tube in the last few years. It actually is one of those tubes, like the methyl bromide I mentioned, that is replacing a couple of former detector tubes, which had a single scale on them. This particular tube, as you can see here, have this scale from 0.5 to 3, which is based on a 1-stroke test. So classic example, if you use this tube and your expectations were that you were probably somewhere in this range, probably the reason you selected that tube as a customer, but you see no color change or just a slight color change that doesn't even reach the first scale mark. Well, rather than going to another detector tube or maybe looking in the instructions to see if I take more strokes, can I therefore interpret a lower concentration? Well, with this tube, and that's these marks on the back that you can just barely make out, with this tube, we can take 2 more strokes for a total of 3, and now read directly off a very precise calibration curve on the tube between 0.1 and 1 ppm. So most of everything else you see on these tubes, a number of the other manufacturers are doing now. Draeger kind of pioneered putting the batch number on the tube, so if you have multiple tubes from multiple batches going out into the field, you know specifically what particular batch they came from. Order codes are on the tubes and the naming of the tube and so forth. But as I say, I believe just about all the manufacturers are doing that today as well. So mentioning what I think is a significant Draeger tube advantage are these, again, tubes with the 2 scales. And I actually started to take a close look at what we have available today, looking at some of our most popular detector tubes and some of those which aren't, but we sell a lot of ammonia, benzene, CO, CO2, H2S, HCl detector tubes, and a lot of our high running tubes, as well as some of those like acrylonitrile, for instance, cyclohexane, hydrazine. A lot of those tubes that we don't necessarily do great volumes with, we still have these 2-scale, making it easy for the customer to interpret a reading. And that's what this particular tube is here. By the way, that is the German for hydrocyanic acid. And if you were to turn that tube about 15 or 20 degrees, it is actually printed in English there as well. So this tube has a N=10 scale from 0.5 to 5. And then it also has a higher range scale from 5 to 50, which I think is based on 2 pump strokes. I don't recall specifically. But I do want to point out here that like many of the Dräger tubes where people have this vision that, oh, the Dräger tubes take a lot of pump strokes, so they must take a lot more time than the competitors. That's not really often the case. So for instance, this is like I say, 1 or 2 stroke scale here. It's only 30 seconds. If you take the additional pump strokes for a total of 10, as you see here on the tube, that's only a 2.5 minute test to measure very low into the 0.5 to 5 ppm range for hydrocyanic acid. And as I say, that's the case with, there's about 35 or so tubes I have listed here. Some of them, like H2S, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 tubes that have the dual scales on them. You'll see a tube like this too that you may wonder, why is there a 1C and a 1D? If you got the 1D, why just keep the 1C? And that's the reason I put this little note here. This particular tube, the 1D, is based on a copper salt. And the importance of knowing what some of these reagents are within the tubes, and it's one of the reasons I like to talk of the Dräger-Tube handbook as my little Bible, and a Bible for people in the field as well. If you take a look at the handbook and you look closely at the reaction, you come to realize when you look under cross sensitivity, this tube readily indicates mercaptans. So methyl, ethyl, propyl, butyl mercaptan, for instance, tertiary butyl mercaptan, are going to be indicated pretty readily on this tube. But this guy with the same basic range overall from 1 to 200 has virtually no influence to up to about 800 parts per million of mercaptans. And so there's a lot of information stored within that handbook that is extremely valuable and worthwhile to understand. As is the again, some of these features with these tubes with the 2 scales on it, making it infinitely easier in the field for the end customer. So also want to mention a little bit about what's on package of Dräger detector tubes. Again, quite similar to what you'll see with the competition. There'll be the basic description, which is, by the way, in 4 languages. Okay, and we do encounter a number of comments back about that that I'll address here in a moment as well. There's a barcode relevant to the part number for the tube, barcode relevant to the batch number, and on the back, in some cases, there's a barcode that can be used with the exact 5000 pump, along with expiration date. And I'll spend a little bit of time developing the story for expiration and what that Draeger advantage is in here in just a few minutes. So what I want to point out over here is this nomenclature here regarding the number of tests. So on the front of a box of Draeger detector tubes, there'll be a small number. It's always in this location, just below the part number, and it's going to be 10, 9, 8, or 5. Most people, when they buy a box of detector tubes, are expecting 10 tubes for 10 tests. Well, in some cases, there's not always 10 tests. There may be 5 tests where there are 5 indicating tubes and 5 pre-tubes in the same box, along with a little piece of tubing to connect those tubes. And some of the reasons for having tubes of 2 different configurations in the same box, a pre-tube, if you will, and an indicating tube, are number one, chemical incompatibility. So by putting the the reagent in a pre-layer in a totally separate tube enables Draeger to get the full shelf life, which is typically 2 full years from the time they leave our facility here in Memphis, which is where our cooler is today and all of our tubes ship from. And that's a big advantage, I think, because many, in some cases of our competitors' tubes, have a 1-year shelf life on them. One competitor alone has about 15% of their program that have a 1-year shelf life. And we have found ways by packaging tubes smartly to extend the shelf life on a common gas or vapor that otherwise wouldn't last as long on the shelf, and get 2 full 2 years out of that tube. So that's a point I like to make. I think it's also, again, relevant and worthwhile exploring what's the justification for Draeger tubes, and also the justification in some cases for Draeger tubes being a little more expensive than the competitors out there. So another point I will make on this particular slide is in regards to expiration date. And as I mentioned a little earlier, typically box of Draeger detector tubes is going to be delivered with a full 2-year shelf life. We pick and ship and date stamp our tubes the day an order is fulfilled. So when it hits Memphis, that's when the tubes, for the most part, receive that expiration date. One classic example that comes to my mind, we have a natural gas detector tube. It typically has less than a 1-year shelf life on it. It's like some of our competitors, shipped from our manufacturing facility in Germany to our facility in Memphis with a 1-year shelf life on it. And just like the competitors' tubes, that shelf life started the day it left our facility in Germany. And so it's ticking away all the time. And so that's one of those tubes that we do periodically get customer inquiries about that haven't used them before. They said, gee, all the other tubes had 2-year shelf life. What's up with this one? I'd like to return them for, for a fresh box. Well, the natural gas tube, as they say, is one of those few ones in our program that only have that less than a 1-year shelf life on them. By the way, I'll also point out in some cases there are some longer length tubes compared to the 5-inch tube. This is about an 8-inch detector tube, and in some cases, what Draeger have done is they've actually connected 2 typically standard length detector tubes using some shrink wrap, again due to the chemical incompatibilities, or in some cases to enable us to expand the scale or scaling on a detector tube over the full length of a tube. So imagine in most standard 5-inch detector tubes, we only have maybe about a 2.5 to 3.5 inch range over which we can put the scale on if we have to have pre-cleanse layers built in. Well, in some tubes, we've actually realized it was better to the customer for us to extend that calibration scale over virtually the entire length of the tube. And so in some cases, we've put 2 tube systems together. And as you'll notice here, as I pointed out earlier, this still enables the customer to have 10 tubes, if you will, for 10 total measurements to be taken. So I mentioned a few minutes ago with regards to the 4 languages. And I don't want to dodge that. In fact, I want to point it out as, again, what I perceive to be an advantage for Draeger, particularly here in the US, as well as Canada for that matter. In Canada, of course, if you're in Montreal, the expectation is you're speaking French language. So when they open up a box of Draeger detector tubes, the expectation is they're going to get French language, not that second language known as English. Also here in the US, not so much necessarily French-speaking areas or territories, if you will, but it's well known that we have a high number of fairly highly populated areas where really the primary language is Spanish. So we think that with our instruction sheets on the front or first page, if you will, it's a two-sided sheet of paper, but on the first sheet, we have the German, English, French, and Spanish, and we think that's an advantage to have that readily available to the customer. Whereas if you compare this to some of the other manufacturers, those instruction sheets are in English. Now, again, you can make the case that English font is nearly twice the size of the Dräger. But again, it's our perspective. It's a spin that I'm putting on it here for the US, and it's actually a necessity in Europe, because in Europe, where our tubes are manufactured, there's European requirements for minimum languages. I just think it's convenient for the US, the way Draeger have it configured, to have all of these languages on a common side of the instruction sheet, along with a graphic of the detector tube. We often get inquiries regarding the Draeger bellows pump compared to the competitor's piston style pump. And so there's been sort of this ongoing banter back and forth about preferential use of a given manufacturer based on the pump, and can I interchange the pumps and tubes? Well, as we talked just a few minutes back, no, please don't interchange the pumps and tubes. If you're using brand X, use brand X pump and tube together. If you're using Draeger, please use our system together. But there are some points that I like to make when it comes to the use of the Draeger bellows style pump. And that first one is that it is actually possible to do a one-hand operation or one-hand measurement. Now, granted, you got to break the tips off the tube. You got to insert the tube into the pump, and you're going to use two hands there in most cases, and unless you're really creative, I suppose it can be done. But if you're on in a scenario where you're perhaps on a ladder, you're on a catwalk, you're trying to make a measurement into a space, let's say, that can be a little bit difficult to access, might be more safe for the operator to be holding on with one hand while trying to take a measurement with the other. I think this system has an advantage to being able to be operated or measurement taken using one pump stroke. The other thing that often surprises people when we do some face-to-face trainings and demonstration is how much of a challenge it is to pull this piston pump handle when the pump is loaded with a tube compared to the Draeger pump trying to squeeze it. Whether you squeeze this pump with or without a tube in it, there's absolutely no difference. If you demonstrate this pump without a tube in it, you'll be able to pull this handle back with your pinky. I'd challenge just about anybody on the line to be able to do that with a tube loaded and trying to do that. Okay, just a point. The smaller profile, I think, is also an advantage in getting in some tight quarters or tight spaces to be able to take measurements. This system, and this is average, okay? This is not anyone in particular. The average pump and tube system is about 18 to 20 inches in length when you got the full sampling train in operation and you're actively drawing a sample, compared to about 11 inches with a standard Draeger pump and tube. Now, there are some of the longer tubes that are going to take this out to probably closer to 15 inches or so, but by and large, they're all just like this. And this system is pretty much all just like that. Talk about the stroke counter. That's something I think at least one of our competitors have done a real nice job with over the last few years. There's a piston pump manufacturer out there that has a device that, just like our pump, when you squeeze complete compression, activates the stroke counter. Their pump, when you pull the handle back the whole way, and it's one sure way of ensuring they lock the handle, is that it also registers a stroke count as well. That's one option that is available. There are also some of the standard piston style pumps out there that either don't have a counter on them or have a manual counter. So you need to remember to twist it each time to make sure you've registered a pump stroke. Like to mention regarding maintenance, that with our pump, there's nothing that requires any grease or lubricants. There's no O-rings that require lubrication. There's no check valves that require lubrication. there's no issue of trying to do a leak test on the pump and allowing the handle to fly back, which can damage the check valve in some of these pumps. So for those using that style pump, just be wary that you don't let the handle fly back if you're trying to do a leak test on the pump. So we don't have those issues with this pump. I think this pump is relatively simple to operate, simple to maintain. And I'd like to just digress for a moment, and I'm going to transition at this time over to a camera. And Sarah, if you're still on the line, are you able to see the camera in the acouro now? Sarah or Frank, can either of you hear me? Can anyone hear me? I can't tell from my end. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead with the demonstration that I planned. Oh, here we go. Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate that, Kimberly. Good. At any rate, I have the standard acouro pump here. This one I checked the serial number, actually is one from my former days. It actually goes back to November of 2001. I've used it quite a bit over the years. I just basically wanted to show that the ease in which one can replace the exhaust valve in this pump. So if this pump's leaking, and traditionally, if there is a problem with the pump, this is probably the area where a simple maintenance could be performed. And a simple maintenance is included based on the spare parts set. This is the Draeger spare parts set that addresses just about everything you're going to need on this pump. And you'll see that there's no tube of grease or any sort of lubricant in there. All you need, and just for the sake of time today, every pump sold comes with a little Allen wrench. I've got a simple screwdriver type device here with an Allen on it. I'm just going to loosen this screw here. And when that's loose, I can simply use this to pry up the plate. That gains me access to the exhaust valve, which you can simply pull free like that. And that little stem on the exhaust valve, that's what engages with the valve seat in the pump. So imagine if I had taken a new valve seat or valve, placed it into that center hole there. Excuse me a minute, a little hard on an angle. Okay, I press it down, and I'm simply using the finger or my thumb I feel it's pressed completely flat. Now, having done that, this little tab on the top engages with the bottom plate of the pump. Align it, snap it in place, and now you can put the driver in the screw here. Just put it so it's snug. And basically, that's all you needed to do to correct probably 99% of the issues with that pump, was to replace the exhaust valve. Now, having done that, the next thing you should do is take an unopened Dräger tube, insert it into the pump. I suggest turning the pump on the tube, compress it, release it, and let it set. This little indicator should not pop up white within 15 minutes. If you need to do a quick test, just simply cradle it in your hand. If you see this bellows expanding, or you see the space here getting wider, you can feel it expanding in your hand, pump's leaking. First thing I would do is what we just did here. Now, that being said, I'm going to take that tube out. Some people have said, well, what about replacing the inlet? You know, I've got a pump now that's 5 or 6 years old. How do you replace that? That's a little more challenging, but I think we can do that pretty quickly. I just need to release this cover, which holds the stroke counter in place. And there's this little blue tab here that releases the blue decorative color plate. That comes free. Beneath that is basically the magnifier for the finished flow indicator. And below that, if I can get it out. Aha. lose something? There it is. Okay, that's just a little simple seat for the finished flow indicator. Now to loosen this, you could simply use a small screwdriver. I don't have a screwdriver at my desk, but I do have a mechanical pencil that I use all the time. So I'm just going to press on this to loosen that up on each side. This will come forward a little bit, and then I'll use this again a couple of times just to wiggle that free. And that's basically the assembly or socket for the inlet for the detector tube. And that's simply a little filter sieve there so that we don't get any glass or any dirt into the pump. So now to reassemble this, again, just because I want to show that I don't need any special tools, I'm just going to take a pencil, put this in here like that, insert this into the channel, and it's pretty clear if you look down the bore of the pump how that goes. I'm going to press it in and give it a quick turn back and forth. Loosen the pencil. That's back in place. Next, what I'm going to do is return these components. That. Oops, sorry. Like that. So forth. This just simply slides in place. It just pretty much finds its own way. With that in place, now I look at the stroke counter. I can see on the one side strokes that I can count. And so I want to put beside the counter itself, and I apologize for the camera. I had a better camera, but it broke about a week ago. Put that in place. Return this, snap it back in, and voila, you basically replaced in a matter of a few minutes everything that you may ever need to replace on this pump. And again, I would, like I say, anytime I've taken apart, do the leak check. And that is basically how simple it is to perform a leak repair or otherwise on your acouro pump. Pretty straightforward. So I'm going to go back now to the slides, talk a little bit about the tubes. I mentioned a little bit about shelf life. Guaranteed most of the Draeger detector tubes that customers are going to purchase are going to have a full 2-year shelf life. With the competitors' tubes, I'm going to show you in another slide or so. Specifically what I'm talking about here with regards to not really being too sure what the customer is going to receive with a shelf life once they've purchased a competitor's line of detector tubes. I also think, and this is maybe just my preference, but when I compare some of the tests that I've run over the years, I find the larger diameter on the detector tube easier to read, and that larger diameter also offers us that very nice advantage of putting 2 scales on a number of our tubes. And as I said, we've got more than 40 tubes in our program right now that are just like that. To the best of my knowledge, there aren't any Draeger tubes that require cold storage. All of our tubes, when they get to our customer, can be stored in this range from 41 to 77. So yes, if you're in some of the warmer parts of the country and you're keeping them in a warehouse that's not air conditioned, you really do need to take into consideration that the tubes need to be stored within this temperature range. There are other manufacturers out there that have tubes that do require cold storage below 50. Likewise, a number of our competitor tubes out there also require temperature correction, which you will find very, very infrequently on any Draeger detector tubes. I'd be hard pressed to name one right now if I had to. But that's not the case on some of our competitors' tubes. And again, we'll take a look at that here in just a moment. So here's an example. This is a recent example that I ordered some tubes in December of 2019. And these are fairly basic detector tubes. I equate these to probably fairly high running tubes for our competitor. And it was interesting that on the package with this huge label, refrigerate upon arrival. That's generally not the case with any of the Dräger detector tubes that I'm aware of. Also found that the shelf life varied, some 16 months, 24 months, 26, and 27 months. So a couple of their tubes are actually 3-year tubes, and I found that interesting, and I'll point it out. They do have some 3-year detector tubes, but it's rare to get anything any better than this if you get them locally. So another interesting note is that 2 of the tubes, both the 1LL that were received, came with 2 different by 4 months expiration dates. So at least in my experience at Draeger, if we ship out tubes like that, we're getting a call with the customer saying, hey, I want the rest of my tubes with a full, longer shelf life on them. But this is actually fairly common. I've seen this with some of the other manufacturers as well. So just like to point out that this is just an actual experience not long ago ordering detector tubes. Another competitor tube that we ordered, it was really in the same time frame, and I was a little surprised. Number one, because again, I thought I was ordering some pretty basic stuff here. So got a couple CO tubes, a CO2 tube, H2S tube. Ordered these December 17th, received almost a month later. Now, okay, near the holiday season, you can make a case for that, I get it. But I sure hope that Draeger isn't doing that with our deliveries. And if we get an order in December for some basic detector tubes, that they're not receiving them by the end of the year. Likewise, shelf life wise, 15 months, 22 months, 24 months. So kind of all over the board. And I think the expectation for most Draeger customers that if they ordered H2S, CO2, and CO tubes, that each one of those boxes of tubes is going to come with a full 2-year shelf life on it. So may not be the case, but at least as far as I know, that's reality when they come out of Draeger. And some people may say it's not a big deal, we use them soon enough, or that doesn't matter to us. But there are some areas where it does matter, and one of those is in first response or fire service, where they're putting things on their rigs, and at least when they get Draeger detector tubes, the expectation is they got 24 months, and so they can rotate or put it on their budgets that if they haven't used the tubes, that at least within maybe 18 to 20 months they want to look, see what they may need to reorder. Whereas if they buy brand X, they may need to be ordering detector tubes at a variety of different intervals based on the individual tubes, and it may come down to that being tube specific as to when they have to budget for those tubes. So that becomes, again, more of an issue in the customer end. Again, just to validate some of the things I've said, because it's just me saying it, here's an instruction sheet, and on this instruction sheet, as you can see, a standard range 1 to 120. That's with 1 stroke. That 1 stroke takes 45 seconds. There is a low range option. That's what we see right here. And you see the stroke correction from 1/2 to 1/10. Well, to translate that, if you want to get the same basic overall range as the Draeger H2S tube, basically from 1, in this case, to 120, ours is 1 to 200, to get down in that 1 to 12 ppm range, it's a 10-stroke test, and that test now takes 7.5 minutes. Okay. Conversely, here's another example. Again, these are some of the tubes that I had ordered. And here's an example, classic example of temperature correction, which I don't think you're going to find in a box of Draeger instruction sheets. This is basically in at 32. So all tubes are calibrated at 20 degrees C, or basically 68 degrees Fahrenheit. So talking American lingo here, 32 degrees at a measurement taken at 32 degrees, this scale must be multiplied by a factor of 0.88. So it's a 12% difference. At 50 degrees, it's 0.96. It's only 4%. But when you get to the higher temperatures, in this case up around 104, correction factor of 1.1, so a 10% difference. There's a fairly high swing based on a temperature range for a detector tube, which in the case of a Draeger detector tube, you don't have to apply these temperature corrections. And I understand some people will make the case it's just a detector tube, and I hate when they say that. It's not just a detector tube. It's a good, solid, precise, reliable system if it's used according to the manufacturer's instructions. And that's not to denigrate these folks, because if you use these tubes and apply these correction factors, those results are going to be really darn good. Again, the range here, 10 to 120, similar to these guys, 90 seconds. And by the way, piston pump, 45 seconds for one stroke, 90 seconds for one stroke. So there's a lot of to be taken into consideration when it comes to not only the pump type, but the manufacturer, as I mentioned earlier. So I wouldn't go interchanging this brand with this brand, even though the pumps look very much alike. And again, in this case, not such good math here, I apologize. This is more like 3 minutes, not 7.5 minutes. But you see the differences here. I will point out, and just to point that out, that Draeger does offer a pump swap program. Please discuss that with your regional sales managers. We're offering the Draeger acouro soft side kit. Doesn't include tubes; they're ordered separately, but we'll take that as an exchange for any of these competitors with an order for 10 boxes of tubes. So I'm just going to quickly go through a few points here. Again, most of the other manufacturers have these types of products, where they've kitted their pumps up. They offer diffusion type sampling tubes, means of doing tests with smoke, whether they be for ventilation checks or for mask fit checks. Please don't use any of the Draeger smoke tubes for mask fit tests. Those really do contain sulfuric acid. It's not stannic chloride. And it's not anything else that somebody else manufactures. So our particular Draeger brand are not recommended for mask fit testing. We do have capabilities for using some of our tubes specialized for air measurements in compressed air, such as airlines or SCBA, high pressure compressors. And we do have specialized kits configured for hazardous materials or hazmat, if you will, as well as civil defense. For law enforcement, we have clandestine sets covering things like ammonia, hydrochloric acid, phosphine, phosgene, iodine, all in one set configuration. Just to give you an idea of what this looks like, because again, I'm not trying to do training on Dräger tubes, but the capability we have for doing compressed air, we can do multiple, in this particular arrangement, 4 at once, tests for condensed oil, CO2, CO, and water vapor. We all have some of these similar accessories, extension hoses, different barb probe types, different configurations for taking gases, measurements in hot flue gases, and so forth. So that being said, covered a lot kind of quickly. Just wanted to, again, as I say, try to justify or explain what we think some of the Draeger tube advantages are. And also would like to mention that when it comes to customer support, we think we have some fairly exclusive options within the Draeger program. One is called the Draeger Voice, our hazardous substances database. Yeah, I know some of you are going to say it's been around a long time, you're familiar with it. We'll talk a little bit about that just briefly. It's basically undergoing a facelift. There's a few little things that we're still trying to get sorted out, so I consider it as a under construction, if you will. But we also just recently, in the last month or so, it's so new we don't have the printed versions yet, but we reintroduced or re-released a new Dräger-Tube handbook. It's the 19th edition, so it's nearly as old as I am. It covers the Dräger detector tubes, so we're all pretty much familiar with what those pages look like. But again, the unique advantage to Draeger here is it's not just the black and white with line drawings. We've actually introduced, and we've had this now for a couple of generations, the actual reproduction of the unused Draeger tube and what a stain is going to look like on a Draeger tube. This one's a nice dramatic one. It's why I like to use it, because it's very clear. But let's face it, not all the detector tubes have such a nice, well-defined endpoint. Some of them, not only ours, but competitors as well, endpoints can be a little more difficult to read. So I think by having colored representation in our handbook, it really gives the end customer a good idea of what they should expect. You know, so if this was not yellow and they were running a test and it became more of a pink color, and I said, well, you know, what the heck is that? That can't be acetic acid. It's got to be something else. Well, it could be something else. It could be another acid gas that, based on the pH of that acid, drives this reaction a little differently. And now maybe it's a pinkish color. Seen that before. The other thing I'll mention here is that we just released a little teaser here, I guess. We just released the Exact 7000 using the microtubes, and all the microtubes that at release or launch date, which was Monday, the 26th, by the way, there are pages in there which address those individual microtubes. So here's the page that has caused a great deal of stir or concern internally as well as externally, that Draeger voice isn't quite up to par. So it's subpar at this point. We recognize that. We've got a pretty darn good team in Lubeck right now that's working to sort that out. We had difficulty over the last couple of weeks just accessing voice. Then when you got into voice, it wasn't stable. Then when it was stable, there was issues trying to figure out, how do I get to what I used to find in the old voice? Here's a link, and anyone who needs it. Frank just sent this to me today, in fact. It seems to be working fine. I've pressed it a few times. I set it up as a shortcut. It's working pretty good. So that's the link right now for voice, if you don't have it, if you need it. And this is what voice looks like today when you open it up. It looks a whole lot different than what it did. I think it's a nice, it's a fresh look. And I think it's one of those things where you're so used to something that when somebody hands you a little different variation of it, we all stumble along a little until we get used to it, until we get accustomed to how it works, and we kick the tires a little bit and find out what drives it and what's the best way to utilize it. So one of the things that I'm going to try to do here is just mention, based on that front page, so right here, when you open up voice, right here is where you can type in the substance. So you can put in chemical name again, an abbreviation like MIBK for methyl isobutylketone, CAS number, and so forth. So I just to kind of walk you through, and then I'd like to show it to you. I did that. I put in MIBK. You then click the magnifying glass. When you click the magnifying glass, if it only finds one result, which it did in this case, one result found, this is what it looks like right here. So when this comes up, the next thing people were saying is, well, what do I do with that? Well, it wasn't clear, and we apologize. We didn't do a very good job of educating people. But if you kind of circle around it, as I did, just playing with it, you realize that you can click here or you can click here to take you to the next phase or the next level. Now, if there were more results, similar substances with similar spellings, it would come up with a list of different results, and then you'd have the option to click on them. What has confused a lot of people here is it says one result found, MIBK. But what Draeger chose to show is the technical name for it, 4-methyl-2-pentanone. Most people on the call probably wouldn't know what that was unless you have a chemical background. So we apologize for that. But if you put this in and you click this and you get something, take a close look to see if it's one of the results. If it's not, or if it's only one result, please just click it and go with that going forward. And what you'll find is the next screen that's going to come up is going to look like this, where it's going to have some of this CAS, UN number, and so forth, some warning information, and it's going to say suitable products for this 4-methyl-2-pentanone. Show more chemical information is an important little detail, again, that we probably didn't do a good job of explaining. But if you click that, it's going to get you to this information here. It's going to show you what we got portables wise, sampling or sorbent tubes, detector tubes, pump systems, and so forth. So I circled this one because what I did was I clicked on this. So when I click on it, this is what came up. And again, it's a little not so clear, but if you click this arrow over here, this chevron, it takes you over to this, where you now have the option to download something. In the case of this example, the download something is the page from the detector tube handbook. So I tell you this up front because I think people need to know this until we get it sorted out. We don't have the IFUs in here that come in the box of tubes yet, and we do not have the special instruction sheet. So what does a special instruction sheet mean? I'm going to go over to here, and you all should now see that front end of voice. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to type in here, and I just like to use caps, MIBK, and I'm going to click on this like I said. So now it comes up, MIBK, one result found. So it's this, and you notice now how I can click on these. If I click on one of them, I get to this information. Here's this information here. And if I click this, now I get some additional information. And where is it? Right here. Shows me some limit value information and also synonyms. So the synonyms are still in here. This has been a complaint. People said, well, the synonyms aren't here. I'm not a chemist. How do I know what this 4-methyl-2-pentanone means? I wanted MIBK. Synonyms are here. Again, I apologize, a little hard to find, but lo and behold, there's the MIBK, which, as I mentioned, if you look closely in one of the earlier screens, it actually references MIBK. Now, if you get down here and, like I say, click on I wanted a detector tube, I get this shown with the tube number. If I use this to travel to the right a little bit, I can download PDF, and let's see, where is it? Here's the PDF, and I go, doggone it, I wanted the instruction sheet. Unfortunately, like I say, not in this version of voice. My expectations are that we should be able to get that rectified and hopefully have that hopefully in the not too distant future. But that's just a little quick tour through the new version of voice. I think once we all get more accustomed to using it, we'll get more familiar with it.